All right, today I'm going to continue on to the next installment on this series on immigration, with a focus on immigration. I think this is part 3 of 4. And I'll do that by talking about NAFTA next, the North American Free Trade Agreement that was implemented in January 1st of 1994. What I have up here are some of our information relating to before the implementation of NAFTA. And so we've already learned about the Bracero program, the agreement between the United States and Mexico to bring in Mexican workers to the United States was started in 1942, intended just for World War II, but ended up being extended all the way until 1964. So then in 1965, Mexico begins implementing the Border Industrialization Program. The Border Industrialization Program begins in 1965. It allows companies from the United States to put factories or assembly centers just south of the US-Mexico border. And I forget how far. It had to be, I want to say something like 10 miles within the border. It had to be really close to the US-Mexico border. And so US companies could build factories or assembly centers right across the border in Mexico, and take advantage of cheaper labor, cheaper taxes, less environmental protections, less labor rights, etc. And now and they would be able to bring in those products back into the United States without tariffs. Now, in Spanish, maquiladoras is a term they use for these factories or assembly centers. So that's what that third bullet point is, maquiladoras, factories or assembly centers. And yeah, there's a lot of different dimensions to this. A lot of this was, especially with regard to NAFTA, was about Mexico privatizing, about Mexico getting rid of, to stop subsidizing and protecting some of its industries. For example, in Mexico, since, for hundreds of years, and to the present, to a certain degree, they've had ejidos. Ejidos are land that are made available to people so that they can grow food and subsist. And so part of it was making that land available, and part of it was also that even if these farmers would grow, basic food, if they would grow, the food that is most common, like corn and beans, the Mexican government would help pay these people a price for their crops if they had extra to sell. They would pay them a price that was, more higher than the going market rate. They'd make it so that they would get at least a certain minimum amount. And that made it so people could subsist and make a living. Under the Border Industrialization Program, Mexico was still doing that subsidizing, and there were still lots of people who would subsist on farming, in part making use of those ejidos. And NAFTA in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico was an augmentation of the border industrialization program. It made it so that, for example, those factories, those maquiladoras, under the BIP, they needed to be, I think it was 27% Mexican owned. With NAFTA, these companies can now be 100% US owned. They didn't need to have any Mexican ownership. NAFTA also made it so that these factories no longer needed to be right along the US-Mexico border. They can now be in the interior anywhere else in Mexico. And it also made it so that Mexico wouldn't be subsidizing any of its industries anymore. The Zapatistas are Mayan people, especially in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas, which borders with Guatemala. Mayan people who named themselves after the indigenous Mexican revolutionary leader from the 1910s, Emiliano Zapata. They were not led by Zapata. Zapata died, what would it be, like 70 years prior. But they named themselves after him. These Mayan people knew that when NAFTA went into effect and when the subsidizing of corn prices was going to stop, that there was going to be a lot of people who could no longer survive the way they had for centuries by being farmers and growing. So on January 1st, 1994, the day that NAFTA kicked in, went into effect, they started a rebellion, an armed rebellion against the Mexican government. And they weren't wrong. The farmers did lose the ability to subsist on farming. So then they moved to these maquiladoras in cities and along the US-Mexico border to try to find work. But these maquiladoras would be running 24 hours a day, 3 8-hour shifts, 24/7. And they would hire 80% of their employees would be women. So families would move, say, to the US-Mexico border, try to get a job at a factory, and only the woman would get hired. And it was only women under the age of 25, and they had no labor protections. They would get fired for anything, including just for getting pregnant or being older than 25. They had no labor protections. The husbands, after moving from the interior to the US-Mexico border, not being able to find work, then crossed into the United States illegally. And so in the 1990s, we had an upsurge in undocumented immigration coming to the United States. You know, just all these different things are interconnected. These economic agreements ended up impacting immigration. And this isn't, you know, a lot of this could have been foreseen. There are many trade agreements, economic unions throughout the world where they know that in addition to allowing the free movement of capital and products, that there are also shifting labor demands in an increasingly globalized economy. And so they also make it so that people, say, that are part of the European Union, people can also move freely, not just money, not just capital and products, but the shifting labor demands. People can also move to where the labor is needed. But with NAFTA, it only allowed for the free movement of capital and products, not people. And so hence we have a big surge in undocumented immigration to the United States in the 1990s. And there's a lot more to that, but I think we'll stick to the immigration aspect for now. Other things happening in the 1990s that affect immigration. In 1995, there was an incident, a domestic terrorism incident in the United States, referred to as the Oklahoma City bombing, where Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols set a bomb on a federal building, blowing it up, killing 168 people, including 19 children. There was a daycare there, and injuring 680. Now, it ended up ultimately being confirmed that this was a domestic terrorist incident. But at the time and later, people still kept focusing on wanting to blame it on foreign terrorists. Initially, they were, at the time before they confirmed it was McVeigh and Nichols, there were all these rumors that they were looking for Middle Eastern people, who were the suspects. And then even after they confirmed who it was, when they passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act the following year in 1996, they still ended up focusing a lot on potential foreign terrorists and not domestic ones, which is what it was. One example of that is that it expanded the types of crimes that could be counted as felonies. That's part of what it did. Now, you might recall that, and one of those things that got expanded is the use of fraudulent documents. Like fake IDs or fake social security cards. And you might remember that about 10 years prior, IRCA in 1986 inadvertently helped create a black market in fake IDs and fake social security cards because it asked employers to just ask for them. You might recall with IRCA, employers, in order to protect themselves for hiring undocumented people, all they needed to do was ask for an ID and a social security card, make a copy of it, keep it on file, and that's it. And so it created a black market for that, for fake IDs. And then 10 years later, it gets expanded as something that counts as a felony. Now, other aspects of this is that it was retroactive, meaning it didn't just punish people starting in 1996. Even though the law wasn't passed until 1996, it penalized people for having done this even prior to 1996. And it also circumvented double jeopardy, which is supposed to be something we don't do. Double jeopardy is when you get penalized or sentenced more than once on the same crime. And that's not supposed to happen. So it turns out that this was unconstitutional and the Supreme Court changed it, but it wasn't until 2009. So from 1996 to 2009, this was being implemented and hurting people, even though it was unconstitutional to do that. In the 1990s and the 2010s, we see states trying to pass laws to address immigration themselves instead of allowing the federal government to do it. In 1994, California's Proposition 187 was one of the first big ones. Proposition 187 stated that undocumented people could not qualify for any government services, nothing. This included education for children. Now, this was never legally implemented. Not to say there wasn't instances where people try to implement it before it was legal to do so. But it was never legally implemented, and so it ended up being declared unconstitutional pretty shortly after. Yes. Proposition 187 is something that California voters voted in favor of, that would make it so that undocumented people could not get any government services. And that no government services, not even education for children. Then in 2010, Arizona's Senate passed Senate Bill 1070, sometimes referred to as the Show Me Your Papers law. This was also sent to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in 2012 struck down a few parts of it. For example, it struck down that they could not make it a criminal offense just to look for a job or to have a job. It didn't make it illegal to not carry your papers with you at all times. And they also struck down the part that said that they could arrest all suspected undocumented people without warrants. And with that note, it was also this idea of like showing up to a neighborhood, a block, and just going through the whole block and checking everybody, all without warrants. So those are the parts that were struck down. The part that was upheld was the Show Me Your Papers part, meaning that police in Arizona can pull a vehicle over with no reason other than suspecting that someone in that vehicle might be undocumented. And then after that, there were a handful of states that passed similar laws: Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Utah, Indiana. Yep.
How is the part that was upheld different from the middle point that was
to have to carry papers?
Yeah.
So let's say a US citizen gets pulled over because an officer believes they might be undocumented. If that person doesn't have their ID or proof that they're here legally, that would be an additional crime. And so that would catch US citizens as well, not just the undocumented. Yeah, so yeah, the way they left it, it's if you're a US citizen and you have, evidence to be here legally, or even if you don't, you ultimately just have to prove it, but that's not an additional crime in itself. Yeah. And so, yes, the Show Me Your Papers law essentially legalizes racial profiling by police in Arizona. Whoops. Then there was also a movement of people who called themselves Minutemen. These were people in the early 2000s who would go to the US-Mexico border and arm themselves and claim that they were there to help US Border Patrol prevent undocumented people and drug smugglers from coming into the United States. And then I'll tell you about one of the incidents that happened having to do with these Minutemen groups. In where are they? Okay, so in 2009, there was this incident where there was a Minuteman group called the Minutemen of American Defense, is what they called themselves. And Shauna Ford was their leader. And this Minuteman group decided that they were going to rob a drug house and then use that money to fund their Minuteman group. So they identified a house that they thought was a drug house. They went in full, a group of them went in full military gear. Knocked at the house at, like 5 in the morning and pretended to be police officers. When they opened there was a family there, mother, father, and child. The child was Brisenia. She's 9 years old. They, they open the door for them. They bust into the house. They shoot all three of them, mother, father, and child, and leave them for dead. They ransacked the house and they did not find any drugs or money. Then and so they just took whatever they could, including the wedding rings off of the fingers of the people they shot. There's a 911 call because the mother, after getting shot, and she played dead. And as soon as they walked out the door, she went to the phone and called the police. And so there's a 911 call of her saying what happened and that. I'm not going to play it for you. There is a documentary that came out a couple of years ago about women in death row that I can play for you. And I'll play a little bit. It's about Shauna Ford, the leader of this group. They were caught. Shauna Ford did get a death penalty sentence. I checked this morning, she's still on death row. And there's just, pain all over in all directions.
Shauna Ford was a hairdresser up in a small town in Washington. She became interested in border issues in Arizona and traveled down here and began hanging out with, trying to join these Minutemen groups or these border militia groups.
Shauna was a patriot. And I supported her. I stood behind her 100%. I'd say it was probably about 2007, I'd say. She asked me if I wanted to be a part of it. So she asked me if I would be a researcher. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? I believe I was probably the first person recruited.
On the southern border. If you happen to be Hispanic walking around with a backpack, that's kind of a telltale sign. This is Shauna Ford with Minutemen American Defense.
Soon after that, Jason Bush and Albert Gasiola came into the picture. When you're talking about killing people and digging out bullets, I mean, you're talking about a serious crime. That's murder. I mean, it shocked me. It scared me. I told her, I said, you really need to think about that. She said, I don't care, it's for my country. And so I told her, I said, I can't do this. And I couldn't.
See my mom. It's been a long time. Might be a little awkward. I haven't seen her since 2010.
I really did encourage them to come visit me because this isn't an environment that they need to be in, or an environment they need to witness.
Yeah, so this documentary is about women in death row, and so in this part, it's looking at her daughter. Basically, Shauna Ford's family in general disowned her. But her daughter's her daughter, and she wants to see her mom, and so it's about kind of her dealing with that. Yes. She was the organizer of the incident, and she claimed that she wasn't there. But the mother says she saw her. And so she's not the one that she had two other people, two men who came in and did the shooting. And initially she claimed she wasn't there, but the mother who survived testified that she saw her there. So yeah, that she's a mother as well. Oh, and one of the two that they mentioned, two men, Bush and Gaxiola. Gaxiola is Latino. I don't know for sure. I want to say he's of Puerto Rican descent. So to anyone that doesn't believe Latinos assimilate, they definitely do. Bring it to Wisconsin. Let's see. Well, actually, before I bring it to Wisconsin, and actually this applies to both, but about at least 70% of farm workers in the whole country in the United States are Latino. This includes documented and undocumented workers. In Wisconsin, it's been difficult, say the last 20 years, to get a good assessment of what percentage Wisconsin dairy workers are Latino and immigrant and undocumented. About 10 years ago, the best number we had was that it was at least 40%. Now with that documentary you watched and similar sources, and now it's believed, does anyone recall? I think it's 80%. Anyone remember from the documentary? 80%. So this 40% is inaccurate, in fact. A couple things there. With such a huge percentage of Wisconsin dairy labor being immigrant, Latino, and a significant portion undocumented as well. As you well know, the dairy industry is very important to the identity of the state. You're gonna read next week. You're gonna read a reading about an article about a town in Illinois, and it's about its historical identity and kind of similar thing with regard to the Latino workforce that isn't included when we imagine what the industry is like. Now, So this important industry in Wisconsin, if the undocumented workers get deported, it will, the cost of milk in particular and eventually cheese would have to like quadruple. And a lot of even more farms that have been closing already will have to close, and a lot of the industry will have to, we're gonna have to be importing more milk and cheese instead of being one of the major producers of it. Now, why is there such a large workforce of undocumented people in Wisconsin? Because of some of the things I touched on before, where if you don't have family in the United States, if you don't have, if you come from a country that has a long backlog, like I mentioned before, the 20-year backlog, if you're coming from Mexico, if you're not highly skilled, there's less opportunities for you to be able to come in legally, even if you apply legally. The other part is in US law, what allows, we still have something similar to the Bracero program. I think they're called H-2A visas that allow farms to bring in workers into the United States, specifically to work at harvest time. But that law is set up so that it's only temporary work, so that when farms need harvesting during the harvesting time of the year is when they need all that work, and then they don't need it the rest of the year. But dairy work is 24/7, 365 days a year. If, it's more convenient for dairy farm owners to hire undocumented people than it is for them to go through the trouble of getting the visas and then having to retrain people every few months because they're not allowed to stay legally longer than just a few months. And so I think that those are important reasons as to why we have such a large undocumented population working in Wisconsin's dairy industry. Other things in Wisconsin having to do related to immigration. In 2011, Wisconsin passed Act 10. Now, Act 10 did a lot of things, but with regard to this subject, it made it so that if someone is undocumented, they do not automatically qualify for in-state college tuition. So like those dreamers, the people who came in, who were brought to this country as children, it doesn't matter if they finished elementary school, middle school, and high school in Wisconsin. When it's time for them to try to go to college, they don't automatically count for in-state tuition. Then the country passed the Real ID Act, and Wisconsin's Act 126 made it so that Wisconsin driver's licenses would fall into the Real ID requirements, kind of creating uniformity across states. Now, Wisconsin, since around the time of Act 10, on that note of driver's licenses, Wisconsin stopped allowing undocumented people to get driver's licenses. In fact, I would say it's one of the biggest hurdles that undocumented people experience when living and working in Wisconsin. Since around 2010, they have not been able to renew. So prior to that, they could go to the DMV and get a driver's license. Around 2010, they stopped being able to renew their driver's licenses. So there's people that have old licenses from like 2008, 2009. And they haven't been able to renew it ever since. They're able to legally buy a house. They can then pay taxes on that house, property tax. They can buy a car. They can get auto insurance. They can even register their vehicle with DMV in Wisconsin, but they cannot get a license to legally drive. And so, and in Wisconsin, it's pretty hard to get around in winter without a vehicle, especially if you're working in more rural areas where there isn't great public transportation. And so that's one of the biggest inconveniences that undocumented people experience. In Minnesota, I think it was just January of this year that they started allowing undocumented people to get licenses in Minnesota. In Illinois, they started allowing it maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Wisconsin still doesn't allow it. Then in 2016, Wisconsin's Assembly passed Assembly Bill 450, which prohibited sanctuary cities, specifically prohibited Madison, Racine, and Milwaukee from becoming sanctuary cities in case they were considering becoming sanctuary cities. They just preemptively forbid it. Sanctuary cities, again, I talked about the sanctuary movement and its origins in the 1980s. Having to do with churches throughout the country trying to protect Central Americans. Now, sanctuary cities is a term that has to do with cities that try to protect undocumented workers who don't commit crimes. Trying to make it so that sometimes their local police departments, they just don't notify ICE, whenever they come across an undocumented person, or some cities create their own IDs so that people who are undocumented can have a valid ID for conducting everyday business, like, I don't know, opening bank accounts or just proving who they are to police, period. But the state of Wisconsin in 2016 prevented these cities from becoming sanctuary cities in case they were considering. What about here in Eau Claire in the Chippewa Valley? People, undocumented people, immigrants, not all immigrants are undocumented. So not all Latinos are immigrants, not all immigrants are undocumented either. So there's different levels there. All of those categories work in high percentages in restaurant kitchens, and not just Mexican restaurants. I'd say most restaurants of every type in Eau Claire and the Chippewa Valley hire Latino immigrants and including undocumented people to work in their kitchens. They don't hire them to be the server, the face of the restaurant when you walk in that sits you down. But they're in the kitchen cooking the food, regardless of what kind of restaurant it is, meaning, if it's Italian food or American bar food or whatever. They also work in the farms, in the dairies, and in the factories of this area. With regard to Mexicans in Wisconsin, most of them are from southern Mexico. Veracruz is the Mexican state from which the largest number of Mexican immigrants to Wisconsin come from. And then other neighboring states like Puebla and Oaxaca in Mexico. Then there's Michoacan. Michoacan is not in the south. It's, let's see, this Jalisco, I think it's around here. Michoacan has a long history in Eau Claire and the Chippewa Valley of being legal immigrants to this area and opening up Mexican restaurants. I'd say, I don't know, 75% of Mexican restaurants in Eau Claire and the Chippewa Valley, the whole region. The owners of the Mexican restaurants all come not only from the state of Michoacan, but from one city in the whole state of Michoacan. Right now I blanked out on the name of it. Right now I blanked out. But yeah, they all the owners of the Mexican restaurants, 75% of them come from just one city in one state. And again, that is an example of chain migration. Chain migration is a term that academics have been using for decades. And it means that people aren't just coming from one country to another country. They're specifically coming from one specific place in one country to another specific place in this country. And so in this example, and let's see, what's the name of that city is called La Piedad. La Piedad, Michoacan. And they come, you know, specifically to the Chippewa Valley and then open restaurants. And yeah, there's that. Janitorial services is another area that people work in disproportionately around here. This means that practically every large business in Eau Claire and the Chippewa Valley, all the big supermarkets, all the big department stores, all of them. The mall, all the big stores, they subcontract independent companies that clean the stores in the middle of the night. And yeah, so immigrants are they have the reputation for taking people's jobs, but immigrants are actually more likely to create their own jobs and to employ others. And this is an example of that because they create janitorial service companies, and they clean every big place in the city. And then the employers, kind of clear themselves of liability by saying, that's an independent contractor. It's not an employee of ours. And then that's one of the ways people do it. And by the way, they do have to pay taxes because in order to create these companies, they have, they get an ITIN, a tax identification number, in order to be able to do that. So then there's El Centro de Conexión. Oh, let's see. I was wrong about Michoacán. Here it is. South of Jalisco. I always imagined it just to the interior of it. And then the states I mentioned, Veracruz, Puebla, and Oaxaca. So these three here. El Centro de Conexión, this is not something you're going to be tested on, just wanted to share with you. There's a local nonprofit that got started in 2010 that works with the local Latino community in the Chippewa Valley. And since the pandemic, it's kind of gone underground. But if anyone's interested in helping to bring it back, or wants to volunteer with them, anything like that, feel free to talk to me. In what was it? I think it was 2014 to 2018. I was president of that nonprofit. So full disclosure, I am connected to that. The DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is a law that they've been wanting to pass in Congress since 2006. And 20 years later, they still haven't been able to pass it. So something that is Dream Act-ish is DACA. This is when in 2012, President Obama, with an executive order, passed DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is similar to the Dream Act that Congress wasn't able to pass. And it's got certain requirements. It basically makes it so that people who came in as children and have been in were in the US during the previous, what would this be, in the previous 5 years? And are at the time no older, than 31, between 16 and 21. And if they completed high school or served in the US military, because you may not be aware that people who are not US citizens can and do regularly serve in the US military. They also, another requirement is that they not have any felonies nor significant misdemeanors. And so if they fulfilled all those requirements, then they would qualify for DACA. DACA would make it so that the people who qualified would not have to be afraid of getting deported for 2 to 3 years. In a way, it becomes similar to the TPS protection I talked about before. And so for 2 to 3 years at a time, they don't have to worry about being deported, and they can renew it every 2 years. By 2017, there were 800,000 people who applied and benefited from DACA protection. In Wisconsin, it was 7,600. Now, during President Trump's first administration, the number of people who reapplied or who applied to renew their DACA protection went down. There were many people who did not, at least 100,000 people who did not renew because they were afraid that President Trump would not honor DACA. And in fact, it went through a lot of back and forth litigation where the Trump administration argued, this was a, why can't I think? This was an executive order done by a president, so the next president should be able to undo that executive order. And then the Supreme Court and other courts, just talking about how they, I don't know, it's just this back and forth. And I honestly don't know the intricate details of the courts and how they go back and forth. Suffice to say that DACA protection still exists today, and people can still renew it. And I don't know how many still have DACA protection today. I'm sure this number has gone down more, but they don't accept any new, no one new can qualify for DACA. It's only the people who already qualified and who have renewed in the past that they can continue to renew. This will probably be the last slide I work on today. You might have noticed that when undocumented people are arrested, they don't say that, they don't put them in jail and they don't put them in prison. They say that they're detaining them and keeping them in detention centers. And so the idea with detention is that they haven't had their day in court and they're simply being detained until their day in court. They haven't been convicted and they don't, they're not being punished. Another point of contention is, how illegal is illegal status, is undocumented status in the US. The being in the United States undocumented, overstaying your visa and being here out of status, or even if you cross the US-Mexico border illegal through an illegal port of entry, or not through a legal port of entry, crossed illegally, and then live in the US. Being the simply act of being in the United States without being out of status or undocumented, being here illegally, is not a crime. It is civil law. Immigration law is civil law. It's, and I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that it's, kind of similar to getting a citation, from, I don't know, from a city or something, and so it's not a crime. With that said, the last couple decades, there's been more and more efforts to make it a crime, or to make different aspects of being here undocumented in the country a crime. And so that, that's part of what helps explain SB 1070, where they're trying to make it a crime just, to be employed. They're trying to make it a crime to look for employment. They're trying to make it a crime to not have proof with you. And so they're trying to make other aspects of being here undocumented something that is not a crime. They're trying to find other ways of making it a crime. And so there's been this process the last 20 years of criminalizing the undocumented to make it crimes. As of last month, there is a court backlog of 3.6 million cases. So people are kept in detention until they can have their date in court. But the court, there's not enough resources in the courts, and hence they have this backlog of 3.6 million cases. And so then inevitably a lot of people, who are not flight risks, who are not, who haven't committed any violent crimes, whose only kind of legal issue is being out of status, they're more likely to be released and be given a court date for them to be notified when their court date comes up. And so there's a lot of people who live in the United States, are undocumented, and they're legally trying to resolve their legal status. All right. These detention centers. And this can change because so these aren't necessarily current today, but these are recent numbers. So the last time I checked, we had 286 detention centers in the US, 70% of them private. And if you remember, I talked about the prison industrial complex and the privatization of prisons. This is an example of that. During the first Trump administration, there was a lot of separation of families. Over 69,000 children separated from their families in 2018 and 2019. This is something that was growing. The amount of money the US government spends on detention centers has grown as well. Here we see 1.8 billion spent in 2010, to 3.1 billion in 2018. And there's also been a growth in electronic monitoring with almost 100,000 people on electronic monitoring. So again, it's people that are waiting to have their date in court that don't have any, haven't been charged with having committed any crimes. And, they're not considered, they believe they want to show up to their court date because they want to resolve their out of status issue. And so, they might have them, increasingly, they'll have them on electronic monitoring instead of paying to have them detained in jails that we don't call jails. During this period of 2006 to 2013, Immigration Customs Enforcement, the arm of Homeland Security that arrests people for deportation in the interior of the country, doubled in size during this period, went up to 60,000 agents, doubling in size. And during the Obama administration, or during this period, this period and right after this, was deporting 400,000 people per year. And I think part of the importance of this, the significance of this, is that even though ICE doubled in size, and even though more people were being deported during this period and right after, none of that changed. None of that made people feel safer. We elected President Trump in the first administration with these fears for the first, and we'll talk about the current one later. ICE doubling in size, more people being deported than ever during the early 2010s. None of that served as comfort for the public that things were getting better. Instead, the way the public was informed about the topic only made them more concerned. In a way, it reminds me of the Mexican crime wave in 1942 that then led to the Zoot Suit riots in 43. It's authorities' effort to demonstrate that they're cracking down on the crime did not lead to people feeling safer and feeling like the issue was being taken care of. Let's see, I'll show you a couple short videos here, and we'll conclude with that today.
The surge.
Very large. More than the budget of every other federal agency combined. The militarization of the U.S. border has added tens of thousands of border patrols, deployed manned aircraft and drones, established military-style bases and surveillance towers, and built hundreds of miles of border fencing for a total cost of $90 billion.
So on that note, we spend more on ICE than we do on any other law enforcement agency, federal law enforcement agency. More than all the others combined.
Border protection except 3 failed attempts at putting virtual fence, super expensive state-of-the-art technologies like thermal cameras and sensors. SBI net was a multi-billion-dollar effort led by Boeing to build an allegedly all-seeing penetrable virtual frontier. 7 years and $1 billion later, SBI net only covers 2.5% of the border, a mere 53 miles. The Department of Homeland Security canceled the project in 2011 because of delays and technological failures, mainly that sensors had trouble distinguishing humans. Now,